In the fast-paced world of air travel, where every second counts and every detail matter, one mistake can change everything. Emily Davis, a dedicated flight attendant with ambitions of leadership, thought she had it all figured out. But during a routine flight, an encounter with a quiet elderly passenger named Grace Parker, unassuming yet composed, set off a chain of events that would test Emily's character and redefine her understanding of respect and responsibility. What Emily didn't realize was that Grace wasn't just any passenger, she was the owner of the airline. In an instant, Emily's dismissive actions caught up with her, putting her career on the line. Faced with the possibility of losing everything she had worked so hard to build, Emily finds herself at a crossroads. Would this mistake define her forever? Or would she rise to the challenge and earn a rare second chance? This is a story of humility, growth, and resilience, a journey of how small moments of kindness and leadership can rebuild trust and change lives. But how far is Emily willing to go to prove she's capable of change? And how will she navigate the quiet yet powerful presence of Grace Parker, who holds not only the future of her career, but also the lessons Emily never knew she needed? The Denver International Airport was bustling as usual. Business travelers checked their phones for emails, while families ushered excited children through the crowded terminals. The crackle of the intercom announced boarding for Flight 928 to Los Angeles. Among the passengers was a quiet, elderly woman named Grace Parker. Grace adjusted the simple strap of her small handbag and approached the gate. At first glance, she looked like someone who had seen much of the world, but demanded little from it. Her silver hair was swept into a neat bun, and she wore a simple navy blue coat. The only hint of her sophistication was in the calm, purposeful way she moved. Grace had lived a life defined by quiet dignity, but today she hoped to be invisible, a habit born from years of valuing privacy over prestige. When Grace boarded the plane, she took an aisle seat near the back. She placed her handbag beneath the seat, her gaze lingering on the people filing in. She had always preferred watching the rhythm of life rather than stepping into its spotlight. The hum of the engines comforted her as the plane filled. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to relax. Meanwhile, Emily Reynolds, one of the flight attendants, stood near the entrance, greeting passengers with a practiced smile. Emily was in her late 20s with an air of polished precision. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, and her blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun. She had been assigned the lead flight attendant role for this trip, a position she had worked hard to earn. Emily took pride in her reputation for handling challenges efficiently. As the last passengers boarded, the plane doors closed, and the flight crew prepared for takeoff. Once the fasten seatbelt sign dimmed, Emily began her rounds. She walked down the aisle, offering snacks and beverages, keeping her movements brisk but courteous. When Emily reached the back of the plane, her attention was drawn to Grace's row. A small child, sitting behind Grace, was restless, kicking the back of her seat in bursts. The boy's mother, overwhelmed, was trying to quiet him, but Grace showed no sign of irritation. She remained still, gazing out the window at the sea of clouds, as though the noise was miles away. Emily paused beside her. "Ma'am," she said, her tone polite but firm, "would you like to change seats? There is an open row near the front. I think it would be more comfortable for you." Grace looked up, her blue eyes soft but unwavering. "I appreciate your concern, but I am fine here," she replied calmly. Emily hesitated, glancing at the child whose legs were still kicking. She felt her patience thinning, though she tried to keep her tone professional. "We want to avoid disruptions," she added, hoping Grace would reconsider. Grace's smile remained gentle, but there was a quiet strength in her voice. "I have taken many flights, dear. Discomfort is often part of the journey. It is nothing I cannot handle." Emily nodded stiffly and walked away. Her pride stung. She had expected Grace to agree. The encounter left her feeling strangely unsettled. Under her breath, she muttered, Some people just refuse to listen. Emily continued serving passengers, though her mind drifted back to the exchange. She prided herself on being efficient, but something about Grace's calm response lingered. After finishing her mid-cabin service, Emily walked past Grace's row again. She stole a glance at the older woman, who was still seated quietly with her hands folded in her lap. There was no trace of frustration on Grace's face, only peace. Just as Emily was about to move on, Grace spoke again, her voice clear but kind. "When you have a moment, I would like to speak with the captain." Emily blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "The captain," she repeated, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Yes," Grace said, folding her hands neatly. Emily's thoughts raced. Passengers rarely asked to speak to the captain unless there was a serious issue, but Grace's demeanor did not suggest she was about to lodge a complaint. Emily gave a polite nod, though unease flickered in her chest. "I will inform him," she said, before walking briskly toward the front. When she reached the cockpit, she knocked lightly before stepping inside. Captain David Ellis, a tall, even-tempered man in his 40s, looked up from the controls. "What is it?" he asked, his brow furrowing slightly. Emily shifted on her feet. "There is a passenger who wants to speak with you," she said. "She is sitting near the back." David tilted his head. "Is there a problem?" Emily hesitated. "I do not think so," she replied carefully. "She seems calm." David rose from his seat, adjusting his captain's badge. "I will handle it," he said with a nod. Emily followed him halfway down the aisle, trying to suppress her nerves. Passengers watched with mild curiosity as Captain Ellis made his way toward the back. When he reached Grace, he smiled warmly and crouched slightly to meet her eye level. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he greeted her. "I am Captain Ellis. I understand you wanted to speak with me." Grace gave a small, polite nod and handed him her boarding pass. "Yes, Captain. I wanted to discuss the importance of tone and respect in service," she said softly. Captain Ellis glanced at the boarding pass. His eyes widened as he read the name. Grace Parker. His mind raced as recognition dawned. Grace Parker was not just a passenger, she was the owner of the airline. "Mrs. Parker," he said, his voice quiet but respectful. "It is an honor." Emily, standing a few steps away, felt the blood drain from her face as she caught the name. Owner of the airline? The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She had just dismissed the woman who held the power to change her career with a single word. Captain Ellis turned to Emily, his expression serious. "I think we need to have a word in the galley," he said. Emily followed him, her heart thudding in her chest. She felt the weight of her mistake pressing down, heavy and inescapable. As the hum of the plane engines filled the silence, Emily braced herself for what was to come. Deep down, she knew that this moment would change the course of her life, and not necessarily for the better. Emily followed Captain Ellis toward the small galley at the front of the plane, her heart pounding with a rhythm she could not steady. The narrow aisle felt endless, each step stretching longer than the last. She could feel the curious gazes of the passengers as they whispered behind cupped hands. When they finally reached the galley, Captain Ellis turned, his face calm but serious. He lowered his voice so no one else could hear. "Emily, do you know who that woman is?" Emily swallowed hard, the truth already forming in her mind, but she shook her head slightly, as if denying it might change things. No, not exactly," she admitted, though her voice faltered. Captain Ellis exhaled through his nose, clearly trying to stay composed. "Her name is Grace Parker," he said. "She owns this airline." Emily's mouth went dry. The hum of the engines seemed louder now, filling the space where her words should have been. "The owner?" she whispered, her eyes widening. "Yes," Captain Ellis confirmed. "And you dismissed her like she was just another passenger causing trouble." His voice was not angry, but it was heavy with disappointment. "Emily, She is known for being private, for observing things without drawing attention to herself. She does not travel with an entourage or demand special treatment. But make no mistake, she notices everything. Emily's stomach churned. She thought back to her conversation with Grace. The polite but firm tone, the calm refusal to switch seats, the request to speak to the captain, it all made sense now. Grace had not been trying to cause a scene. She had been watching, listening, taking note of how she was treated. "I had no idea," Emily said, her voice barely a whisper. Captain Ellis crossed his arms, studying her carefully. "That is exactly the problem, Emily," he replied. "You should not have to know someone's title to treat them with respect." The words stung because they were true. Emily prided herself on being efficient and professional, but in this instance, she had let her impatience cloud her judgment. She felt a wave of shame wash over her as she replayed the moment in her head. Grace had been nothing but composed, and Emily had treated her like an inconvenience. "What do I do?" Emily asked finally, her voice small but earnest. "How do I fix this?" Captain Ellis's gaze softened, though his tone remained firm. "You need to apologize, and not just for appearances. You need to show her that you understand your mistake. If you handle this the right way, it might be enough to earn her forgiveness. If you do not—" He trailed off, but the implication was clear. Emily nodded, though her chest felt tight. "I understand." Captain Ellis gave her an encouraging nod before stepping back into the main cabin. Emily took a deep breath, straightened her uniform, and began walking down the aisle. Each step felt like she was approaching a verdict. When she reached Grace's seat, she paused for a moment before leaning slightly forward. Grace had returned to looking out the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The soft sunlight cast a glow over her calm features. "Mrs. Parker," Emily began, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Grace turned her head slowly, her expression neutral but attentive. Emily took a deep breath. "I wanted to sincerely apologize for the way I treated you earlier. I was impatient and dismissive, and that was unacceptable. You deserved better, regardless of your status or title." She hesitated, then added, "I regret that it took me this long to understand that." Grace watched her carefully, her blue eyes thoughtful. Emily braced herself for anger or worse, dismissal. But after a long pause, Grace nodded slightly. "I appreciate your apology," Grace said, her voice soft but steady. "But respect is not just about words. It is about actions, consistent, thoughtful actions. It is about how you treat everyone, not just the people you believe are important." Emily nodded, the words hitting her deeper than she had expected. "You are right," she said quietly. "I have a lot to learn." Grace's gaze softened, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of her lips. "We all do," she replied. "The important thing is that we are willing to grow." Emily felt a flicker of relief, but knew the conversation was not over. Grace's calm demeanor did not mean she had forgotten, or that she would simply let the incident go. The weight of her mistake still hung in the air. The rest of the flight continued without incident, but Emily was hyper-aware of everything she did. She went out of her way to make sure the passengers were comfortable, and she gave extra care to her interactions with her crew. Still, there was a tension she could not shake. Every glance from her co-workers felt like silent judgment, and every whisper seemed like speculation about what would happen next. When the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, the usual buzz of excitement filled the cabin. Passengers began to unbuckle their seatbelts and gather their belongings. Emily moved through the aisles, helping where she could, but her mind was elsewhere. As the plane rolled to a stop at the gate, Grace stood gracefully, her small handbag in hand. Emily watched as she made her way toward the front of the plane. Just as Grace reached the galley, she paused and turned to Emily, who had been standing nearby. "I hope you remember this moment, Emily," Grace said quietly. "Not as a punishment, but as a lesson. Emily nodded, her throat tight. I will, she promised. Grace's gaze lingered for a moment longer before she stepped off the plane. Emily let out a slow breath, but the tension in her chest remained. She knew this was not over. Grace had been kind, but she had also made it clear that there would be accountability. As the last of the passengers disembarked, Captain Ellis approached Emily. His expression was unreadable, but not unkind. She is meeting with senior leadership as soon as she lands, he said quietly. What happens next is up to her. Emily felt the weight of his words settle over her. This was no longer just about an apology. This was about whether she was the kind of person who could take responsibility and grow, or the kind of person who would be defined by her mistakes. As the flight crew began their post-flight duties, Emily stood alone for a moment in the now empty cabin. The future felt uncertain, but one thing was clear: her actions from this point forward would determine the course of her career and her character. She was at a crossroads, and there was no turning back. The airport terminal was bustling with life as Grace Parker walked with a quiet sense of purpose toward the executive lounge. The sunlight streaming through the wide glass windows cast a soft glow over her, but Grace paid no attention to her surroundings. Her mind was focused on the steps ahead, each one as deliberate as the next. Emily watched from the airplane doorway as Grace disappeared into the terminal. She took in a slow, deep breath, as though she could calm the storm inside her. But her thoughts churned, replaying Grace's parting words. This is a lesson, not a punishment. Captain Ellis approached, his calm but serious expression unchanged. Emily, we need to talk, he said quietly. The crew can handle the cleanup. Emily nodded, following him into the small crew lounge tucked at the end of the jet bridge. The moment the door shut, the hum of the terminal faded, replaced by a tense silence. Captain Ellis crossed his arms, his eyes steady. I know you are rattled. Anyone in your position would be. But I need you to understand something, Emily. Grace Parker is not like anyone else you have met. Emily shifted nervously. You keep saying that, but what makes her so different? Captain Ellis sighed, running a hand over the back of his neck. Grace Parker does not just own this airline, she built it from the ground up. She started with a single route and turned it into one of the most respected airlines in the country. She built her reputation on integrity, respect, and the belief that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, whether they are a captain, a flight attendant, or a passenger in economy class. Emily's face softened as the weight of his words sank in. She imagined a younger version of Grace, ambitious but compassionate, determined to prove that respect was the foundation of true success. Captain Ellis continued, his tone gentler now. Grace has seen everything: the good, the bad, and the unforgivable. She is not the type to explode or humiliate someone publicly. Instead, she watches and measures your response. How you handle this mistake is what she will remember, not just the mistake itself. Emily felt her throat tighten with a mixture of regret and fear. Do you think I have already ruined my chances? She asked softly. Captain Ellis shook his head. I do not know, but I can tell you this. She values resilience and growth. If you want any hope of redemption, you need to be honest, not just with her, but with yourself. Emily sank onto the small bench by the wall, her shoulders slumping. I thought I was good at this job, she whispered. I thought professionalism meant control, but all I have done is let my pride and impatience control me instead. Captain Ellis sat across from her. Emily, being good at this job is not just about following protocol. It is about how you make people feel. We have to balance authority with empathy. Sometimes that means slowing down and listening instead of trying to fix everything immediately. Emily nodded slowly, her eyes stinging. She had spent years trying to climb the ladder, thinking that efficiency and leadership meant showing strength. But Grace had shown her that true strength came from patience, kindness, and the humility to admit when you were wrong. "I need to make this right," Emily said, a quiet resolve settling in her voice. Captain Ellis gave her a reassuring nod. "You will have a chance. I heard from one of the senior executives Grace has asked for a meeting with you at corporate headquarters tomorrow afternoon." Emily's eyes widened. "She asked for me?" "Yes," Captain Ellis confirmed. "And Emily, if she is giving you this chance, it means she has not made up her mind yet. But this is not just a formal meeting. She wants to know who you are at your core." Emily felt her pulse quicken. The idea of facing Grace again made her stomach twist with nerves. But beneath the fear, there was something else, a flicker of hope. Grace had not shut the door completely. She was offering a chance to explain herself, to grow from this mistake instead of being defined by it. The next morning, Emily woke early, her nerves making it impossible to sleep in. She dressed carefully, choosing her professional attire with intention: a navy blouse, a tailored blazer, and slacks that fit neatly. She wanted to look composed, but she also wanted to convey humility, not arrogance. Her small apartment was quiet as she packed her bag, double-checking the address for the meeting. The walls of her space were lined with reminders of her ambition: aviation books, framed certificates, and a picture of her family proudly celebrating her first promotion. Emily paused as she stared at the picture. Her father had always told her that being strong meant more than appearing confident. "Strength means admitting when you need to do better," he used to say. The thought steadied her as she left her apartment and hailed a cab to the airline's corporate offices in downtown Los Angeles. The sleek, modern building loomed above her, its glass reflecting the morning sun. As she walked into the lobby, she felt small, as though every step she took echoed her uncertainty. The receptionist greeted her with a professional smile and motioned to a nearby seating area. "You are early. Please take a seat. Mrs. Parker will be with you shortly." Emily nodded and sat down, her palms sweating despite the cool air conditioning. Soft instrumental music played overhead, but it did little to calm her nerves. Each minute felt like an hour. Every time the elevator doors opened, Emily's breath hitched, but it was never Grace. Finally, the elevator chimed again, and Grace stepped out. Her posture was upright, her expression composed but unreadable. She wore a cream-colored suit that was as simple as it was elegant. She met Emily's gaze, and for a moment, Emily felt exposed, as though Grace could see everything she had been trying to hide. "Emily," Grace greeted her, her voice low but steady. "Come with me." Emily stood quickly, following Grace down the hallway to a private conference room. The room was simple, no frills, just a long table, 2 chairs, and a large window that overlooked the city. Grace gestured for Emily to sit, then took the chair opposite her. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Grace folded her hands on the table, her expression thoughtful but calm. "Let us get straight to the point," she began. "You made a mistake, a significant one. But what I care about most is what you plan to do next." Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. This was not just a conversation. It was a test not of her knowledge, but of her character. "I know I cannot take back what happened," Emily said, her voice quiet but steady. "But I can learn from it, and I will show you through my actions that I understand what respect really means." Grace's eyes softened, though her posture remained firm. "That is what I wanted to hear," she said. "But words alone are not enough. I need to see it." Emily nodded, determination rising in her chest. "You will," she promised. As the city stretched out beyond the glass window, Emily felt the first stirrings of something stronger than fear-hope. This was her chance, and she was not going to waste it. The sunlight streaming through the tall window bathed the small conference room in a quiet glow. Emily sat across from Grace, the weight of the conversation still heavy in the air. Grace's steady gaze was not harsh, but it held a depth that made Emily feel as though she was being seen not just for her actions, but for who she was beneath them. Grace folded her hands neatly on the table, her expression thoughtful. "Emily," she began, her voice calm but deliberate, "I am not here to intimidate you. I am here because I believe accountability is not about punishment, it is about growth." Emily swallowed hard and nodded. "I understand, Mrs. Parker, and I want to grow from this." Grace tilted her head slightly, studying her. "I hope so. Because whether you realize it or not, you have been given something rare, a second chance. I could have made a formal complaint, ended the conversation right there on the plane, and had someone else handle the fallout. But I didn't." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Do you know why?" Emily hesitated, unsure how to respond. "No, ma'am," she said quietly. Grace leaned forward slightly. "Because I see potential in you. You were not wrong to want order or to prevent disruptions. But leadership is not about control, it is about connection." Emily felt her throat tighten. No one had ever framed it that way before. She had spent her career trying to stay composed, to command respect through competence and authority. But Grace was telling her something different, something deeper. "When I first started this airline," Grace continued, her voice softer now, "I had nothing but a borrowed plane and a promise to treat people with dignity. I worked every job there was, from handling baggage to cleaning the cabin after flights. I made mistakes, too. Big ones." Emily's eyes widened. The thought of someone as composed as Grace making mistakes was difficult to imagine. "But I learned," Grace said, meeting Emily's gaze, "not from the praise I received, but from the moments when I failed. Those moments shaped me far more than any success ever could." Emily took a slow breath, her heart still heavy with regret, but also starting to stir with something else, a sense of purpose. "I want to do better," she said, "not just because I need to keep my job, but because I want to be the kind of person who earns respect the right way." Grace's expression softened, and for a moment there was something almost maternal in her eyes. "Good," she said. "But remember, talking about change is easy. Living it is much harder." She rose from her chair, signaling the end of their conversation. "I will be keeping an eye on you, Emily, not to find fault, but to see how you handle the next challenge that comes your way." Emily stood as well, smoothing the front of her blazer. "Thank you, Mrs. Parker. I won't take this for granted." Grace gave her a small nod. "We will see." With that, she opened the door and motioned for Emily to follow her back to the reception area. The air felt cooler in the wide hallway, but Emily's nerves had calmed. As they reached the lobby, Grace stopped and turned to her. "Take today to reflect. Tomorrow, return to your duties with a clear mind. Growth is a process, not an instant fix." Emily nodded again, humbled. "Yes, ma'am." Grace's gaze lingered for a moment before she walked away, her footsteps light but deliberate. Emily stood there, watching her until she disappeared behind the glass doors. She felt small in that moment, but not insignificant. There was a difference between feeling small from shame and feeling small in the presence of someone who reminded you how much room you had left to grow. That evening, Emily returned to her apartment and sat alone in the quiet. The city lights twinkled outside her window, but she barely noticed them. She replayed Grace's words in her head. "Leadership is about connection, not control." Her eyes drifted to the framed photo of her family on her bookshelf. She remembered her father's words again. "Strength means admitting when you need to do better." The memories felt sharper now. She had wanted so badly to succeed that she had forgotten that kindness and respect were not weaknesses, they were strengths. As the evening stretched on, she made a promise to herself. She would not wait for another mistake to change her. She would start now, taking every opportunity to show respect, not because she had to, but because it was the right thing to do. The next morning, Emily arrived at the airport early, dressed neatly in her uniform. Her steps felt different, measured, deliberate, like she was no longer just moving through the motions of her job. She was ready to face whatever the day brought. Her assignment was a short domestic flight, but her nerves still buzzed with the memory of the last trip. She took a slow breath as she walked down the jet bridge and greeted her team with a genuine smile. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her tone warm and sincere. Her co-worker Mark, who had noticed her tension during the last flight, raised an eyebrow but smiled back. "Morning, Emily." As the passengers began boarding, Emily moved with renewed focus. Each greeting was deliberate, each smile genuine. When a mother with two young children approached, looking flustered as she tried to settle them into their seats, Emily stepped in without hesitation. "Let me help you," she offered, bending down to adjust the children's seatbelts. "Take your time." The mother gave her a grateful look. "Thank you," she said with a sigh of relief. Emily smiled as she finished. "No problem. You're all set." As she continued down the aisle, she noticed a passenger with a large carry-on, struggling to fit it into the overhead bin. In the past, Emily might have given a standard reminder about the size of bags, but now she took a different approach. "Let me help," she said, reaching up and carefully adjusting the suitcase until it fit snugly. The man nodded in appreciation. "Thank you. I thought I was going to have to check it." "No need," Emily replied. "Enjoy the flight." By the time the plane took off, the usual sense of chaos had been replaced by a feeling of calm. Emily moved through her duties with a newfound sense of balance, not rushing, but not hesitating either. Halfway through the flight, Captain Ellis called Emily to the front. He gave her a small but approving nod. "I noticed the difference today," he said quietly. Emily felt a wave of emotion rise in her chest. "I am trying," she admitted. Captain Ellis smiled. "It shows." Emily returned to the cabin, her heart lighter. She was beginning to understand that change was not about perfection. It was about progress, one choice at a time. As she passed down the aisle, she noticed a familiar face in the first row. Grace Parker sat with her hands folded, watching her with quiet approval. Their eyes met, and Grace gave her a subtle nod. Emily's smile was steady now, not forced, not nervous, just real. She had made mistakes, but she was learning. And for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. As Flight 745 descended smoothly toward the runway, Emily felt an unusual calm settle over her. The hum of the engines was steady, matching her heartbeat. She had spent the entire flight focusing on small moments, offering help, sharing kindness, and treating every passenger as though they mattered. Now, as the plane taxied to the gate, she walked down the aisle to assist with the disembarkation. The cabin buzzed with the usual post-flight excitement as passengers gathered their belongings, eager to reach their final destinations. When the plane came to a full stop and the seatbelt sign dimmed, the first passengers began stepping off. Emily smiled at each of them, wishing them a pleasant day. But her gaze kept flicking to the first row where Grace Parker sat, calm as ever, her small handbag resting on her lap. Grace stood gracefully, stepping into the aisle with her usual poise. Emily felt her breath catch as Grace approached, the memory of their previous conversation still fresh in her mind. She expected Grace to walk past her with a polite but distant nod. Instead, Grace paused just as she reached Emily, meeting her eyes with a look of quiet reflection. "Walk with me," Grace said softly. Emily hesitated, surprised, but she nodded and stepped out of the galley to join her. The murmurs of the remaining passengers faded as they exited the plane, leaving the aisle quiet and still. Grace led Emily off the jet bridge and into the terminal where the noise of the airport filled the space once again. They stopped near a set of large windows overlooking the runway. Planes stood in neat rows, their wings catching the early afternoon sunlight. Emily stood silently beside Grace, unsure of what to say. She could feel the gravity of the moment, the unspoken questions hanging between them. Finally, Grace spoke, her voice soft but deliberate. "You did well today," Grace said. "I watched how you handled the passengers. You were attentive, respectful, and calm. It was a noticeable change." Emily felt a rush of gratitude but knew this was not the time to celebrate. "Thank you," she said earnestly. "I am trying to be better." Grace turned to face her fully, her expression thoughtful. "Emily, I have met many people in my life, some who let their mistakes define them, and others who choose to learn from them. Do you know what separates them?" Emily shook her head, her eyes searching Grace's for answers. "Humility," Grace said simply. "The ability to admit when you are wrong, to own your shortcomings, and to choose growth over defensiveness." Emily felt a familiar tightness in her throat. She had spent years trying to prove herself, believing that any sign of vulnerability would be seen as weakness. But now, standing in front of Grace, she realized that the strongest thing she could do was to be honest. "I was wrong," Emily said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "When I spoke to you on that flight, I was impatient and dismissive. I made assumptions, and I let my pride get in the way. I told myself I was just doing my job, but the truth is, I was not listening. I was trying to control a situation instead of understanding it, and I am truly sorry." Grace's eyes softened as she listened, but she remained quiet, giving Emily the space to speak. Emily took a deep breath and continued. "I know an apology alone does not make things right, but I want to be the kind of person who learns from this, not just for today, but for every day moving forward." For a moment, there was silence between them. Then Grace nodded, a small but approving gesture. "Apologies are not about erasing mistakes," she said. "They are about acknowledging them and showing that you are willing to change. And from what I saw today, you are on the right path." Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. Grace's words felt like the first ray of sunlight after a long storm. Grace's expression grew thoughtful again. "But remember, this lesson is not just for you. It is for the people you lead and the people you serve. Every small interaction, every word, carries weight. When you show respect and kindness, you set a standard that others will follow." Emily nodded, her heart full but steady. "I understand." Grace smiled a small, quiet smile, but one filled with genuine warmth. "Good." As Grace continued toward the lounge, Emily stood for a moment, watching her walk away with the same grace she had displayed on the plane. There was no anger or lingering tension in Grace's departure, only a sense of completion. Emily turned back toward the gate area, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. She had expected Grace to be cold or distant, to hold the mistake over her like a weight. Instead, Grace had shown her something rare kindness that did not overlook accountability. It was the kind of leadership Emily wanted to embody from now on. She rejoined her crew at the gate, her movements more assured. Mark, who had always been a steady presence on her team, approached with a curious smile. "So, what did Mrs. Parker say?" Emily met his eyes with a quiet smile of her own. "She said I did well, and she reminded me why we do what we do." Mark nodded, his expression softening. "That is high praise coming from her." "It is," Emily agreed. The post-flight duties passed in a blur of conversations and checklists, but this time, Emily felt fully present in every interaction. She took time to listen to her team, to ask questions, and to offer small gestures of appreciation, a hand with a luggage cart, a thank you after a completed task. The tension that had once followed her like a shadow seemed to dissipate, as respect flowed both ways. Later that evening, as she walked through the parking lot toward her car, Emily noticed a woman with a stroller struggling to lift her luggage into the trunk of her car. Without hesitation, Emily hurried over. "Let me help you," she offered, reaching for the bag. The woman smiled gratefully. "Thank you so much. It has been a long day." Emily lifted the suitcase easily and set it inside. "I understand," she said kindly. "Safe travels." The woman gave her a nod of thanks before driving away. Emily stood for a moment, watching the tail lights disappear. A small gesture, perhaps, but Grace's words echoed in her mind. Every interaction carries weight. As she slid into the driver's seat of her own car, Emily allowed herself a small but genuine smile. She had made a mistake, but she was determined to rise from it, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But for the first time in a long time, Emily felt prepared to meet them with patience, humility, and the quiet strength that Grace had shown her. As she drove into the soft glow of the city, she knew one thing for certain. This was not the end of her journey. It was only the beginning. The early morning sky was painted in soft hues of orange and gold as Emily arrived at the airport. The cool air brushed against her face as she walked through the automatic doors, her uniform pressed and neat. Despite the hum of activity around her, Emily felt centered in a way she had not in a long time. The previous day's conversation with Grace Parker still echoed in her mind. Grace's kindness had not been an act of leniency, it was a challenge, a call to rise above her mistakes and truly embody the values she had claimed to learn. As Emily entered the crew lounge, the familiar scent of coffee greeted her. The room was filled with flight attendants, gathering their bags, reviewing schedules, and chatting quietly before their flights. Emily spotted Mark sitting at one of the tables, scrolling through his phone. "Morning," she greeted him with a genuine smile. Mark looked up, surprised by the brightness in her tone, but he returned the smile. "Morning, Emily. You're in early." "I wanted to prepare," she said simply. Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You seem different, in a good way." Emily chuckled softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I hope so." She picked up her clipboard and scanned the details for her next flight, Flight 382 to Phoenix. It was a full flight, which meant they would need to be efficient but patient, a delicate balance she was finally beginning to understand. By the time the crew assembled at the gate, Emily had already run through the checklist twice, ensuring every detail was in order. As passengers began to board, Emily moved with purpose, greeting each person warmly. An elderly man with a cane paused in front of her, adjusting his glasses. "Is this the right gate for Flight 382? "Yes, sir," Emily replied, stepping aside to guide him. "Would you like some assistance getting to your seat?" The man smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That would be kind of you." Emily nodded and gently took his arm, walking him down the aisle. She noticed how many other passengers watched the interaction, some with quiet admiration, others with the blank stares of people too preoccupied with their own concerns. As she helped the man settle into his seat, she remembered Grace's words, "Every interaction carries weight." "Enjoy your flight," Emily said, giving the man a reassuring nod. The flight took off smoothly, the plane climbing through the thin morning clouds. Emily moved through the cabin with practiced ease, serving coffee and juice, answering questions, and keeping the flow of service uninterrupted. But this time, she paid closer attention to the way passengers spoke, to the small signs of discomfort or stress. Near the middle of the flight, a woman with a baby was struggling to calm the child as he began to cry. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the noise. Emily walked over with a calm, steady presence. She crouched beside the woman, her voice low and soothing. "Would you like some warm water for the baby's bottle?" The woman looked up, her eyes tired but grateful. "Yes, please, that would help." Emily returned quickly with the water and offered an extra blanket. The baby's cries quieted as the mother fed him, and the tension in the surrounding rows seemed to ease. At the front of the plane, Captain Ellis watched the scene unfold from the cockpit doorway. His expression was thoughtful as he observed Emily's interactions. When she made her way back to the galley, he approached quietly. "You're handling things well," he said, nodding toward the cabin. Emily smiled, a touch of humility in her expression. I am trying to be more present, less reactive. Captain Ellis studied her for a moment, then crossed his arms. I spoke with Grace yesterday. Emily's smile faded slightly. You did? He nodded. She told me she was impressed by how you handled the follow-up conversation. She also said she believes you have the potential to become a strong leader. Emily felt a mix of emotions, pride, relief, and a lingering sense of responsibility. I want to live up to that, she said quietly. You will, Captain Ellis said. But remember, it is not about proving anything to Grace or to me. It is about becoming the person you want to be. Emily nodded, his words settling into her heart. Thank you, she said sincerely. As the flight began its descent, Emily moved through the cabin, making final checks and assisting passengers as they prepared for landing. A young boy in one of the front rows tugged at her sleeve as she walked by. Miss, he said shyly, this is my first flight. Emily knelt down so she was eye level with him. How do you like it so far? The boy smiled, though his fingers fidgeted with the straps of his backpack. It's cool, but it's kind of scary when it gets bumpy. Emily nodded, understanding. That's normal. But do you want to know something cool? The boy's eyes widened with curiosity. Every time the plane bumps, it is just moving through a pocket of air, kind of like how a car goes over little hills on the road. And the pilots up front, they've done this thousands of times. They know how to keep us safe. The boy's face lit up. Really? Really, Emily said, with a reassuring smile. You're in good hands. The boy nodded confidently and settled back into his seat. When the plane landed smoothly in Phoenix, the passengers disembarked with grateful smiles and quiet nods of thanks. Emily stood near the exit, wishing each one a good day. As the last passenger left, Mark approached with a grin. I saw you with the kid in row 2, he said. You've got a way of making people feel at ease. Emily smiled. It is just about being there for people, you know? Mark's grin widened. That's what makes you good at this job, Emily. Later that afternoon, after the post-flight cleanup was complete, Emily sat in the quiet crew lounge, staring out at the tarmac. She thought about the day, about Grace, the elderly man, the mother with the baby, and the young boy. Each moment had reminded her of what Grace had said. Leadership is not about control, it is about connection. For the first time, Emily felt like she understood what it meant to lead with respect and care. It was not about perfection or status. It was about showing up moment by moment with patience, humility, and kindness. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the runway, Emily felt a quiet but unmistakable sense of peace. She still had a long way to go, but she was on the right path. With that thought, she rose, grabbed her bag, and headed out into the golden evening light, ready to face whatever came next. The next morning, Emily sat in her small kitchen with a cup of coffee, staring at her phone. She had received an email from HR late last night, a formal invitation to a follow-up meeting with Grace Parker at corporate headquarters. The message was brief, but carried weight. Mrs. Parker has requested a one-on-one meeting to discuss your continued progress. The meeting will take place tomorrow at 2 p.m. Emily's stomach tightened as she reread the words. Though she had made strides to grow and improve, the reminder of the upcoming meeting stirred up her nerves again. She knew that Grace was not one to make decisions lightly. This conversation would be another test, one that could shape the future of her career. She took a slow breath and set her mug down. The fear of failing lingered in her mind, but so did Grace's words. Accountability is not about punishment, it is about growth. By the time Emily arrived at the airline's corporate offices, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sleek glass windows. The lobby was just as quiet and polished as before, with soft instrumental music playing in the background. Emily approached the front desk, where the receptionist greeted her with a familiar smile. "Mrs. Parker is expecting you," the receptionist said, gesturing toward the executive wing. Emily nodded, offering a polite "thank you" as she made her way down the hallway. She felt the same weight in her chest as before, but this time there was something steadier beneath the nerve's determination. The conference room door was open when she arrived. Grace sat at the table, her posture as poised as ever. She wore a simple charcoal gray suit, her silver hair pulled back neatly. When she looked up, her expression was unreadable but calm. "Emily," Grace greeted her, motioning for her to sit. Emily stepped inside, closing the door behind her before taking the seat across from Grace. The afternoon light streamed in through the large window, painting the room with a soft golden hue. For a moment, there was silence. Grace folded her hands on the table and studied Emily with quiet intensity. "You have had some time since our last conversation," Grace began. "Tell me, what have you learned?" Emily's heart pounded, but she met Grace's gaze head-on. "I have learned that respect is not just something you show when it is convenient. It is something you show in every moment, no matter who you are speaking to. I have learned that leadership is not about control, it is about connection, as you said. It is about listening and being present, not just completing tasks." Grace nodded slightly, though her expression remained measured. "And what do you believe respect looks like in action?" Emily thought carefully before responding. "It looks like patience, especially when things are difficult. It looks like kindness, even when no one else is watching. It is helping someone without expecting anything in return. It is taking responsibility when you make mistakes instead of making excuses." Grace's lips curved into a faint smile, the first sign of warmth since the meeting began. "Good," she said. "That is the kind of answer I hope to hear. But I am not only interested in your words, Emily. I have been monitoring your progress carefully these past few weeks." Emily swallowed but nodded, knowing Grace's eyes had been on her long before she had ever realized. Grace leaned back in her chair, her tone softening. "You have grown. I have seen it in how you interact with your team and how you treat passengers. The feedback from Captain Ellis and your colleagues has been consistent. You have shown humility, resilience, and accountability. But the real question is, what do you want for yourself moving forward?" Emily paused, considering the question. She had spent so much time trying to earn back the trust she had lost that she had not stopped to think about what she wanted next. But now, the answer felt clear. "I want to be a leader who makes people feel valued," Emily said. "I want to build a career based on trust and respect, not on fear or control. I want to continue growing, even when it is hard, because I know I can do better. I have seen how much a small moment of kindness can change someone's experience, and I want to be someone who creates those moments, not just for passengers, but for the people I work with every day." Grace's gaze softened as she listened, and when Emily finished speaking, she nodded slowly. "That is a good answer," she said quietly, "and I believe you mean every word." Emily felt a wave of relief but stayed composed. Grace unfolded her hands and rested them on the table. "I am going to tell you something I rarely share. When I first started this airline, I made a mistake that nearly cost me everything. I was so focused on proving myself that I lost sight of the people who made success possible. It was not until someone I deeply respected reminded me that success means nothing without integrity that I finally understood what I was missing. That lesson shaped me more than any achievement ever did." Emily absorbed Grace's words with quiet reverence. The idea that someone as composed and respected as Grace had once made similar mistakes made her feel less alone in her journey. Grace stood, signaling that the meeting was coming to an end. Emily rose as well, unsure of what Grace's final decision would be. "Emily," Grace said, her voice calm but resolute, "I believe you have earned the chance to continue your career here. You have proven that you are willing to take responsibility, learn from your mistakes, and grow into the kind of leader we need." Emily's breath caught in her throat, and a wave of emotion washed over her. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "I will not let you down." Grace smiled a rare, genuine smile. "I know you will not. But remember, this is not the end of your growth, it is only the beginning. Keep listening, keep learning, and never forget that leadership is a privilege, not a right." Emily nodded, the weight of Grace's words settling into her heart. "I will remember." As Grace walked Emily to the door, she paused and added, "You have the potential to do great things, Emily. Do not waste it." Emily felt a rush of pride and responsibility as she stepped out into the hallway. The air felt lighter now, and she walked with a steady confidence she had not felt in a long time. By the time she reached the lobby, she was smiling not just because she had been given a second chance, but because she knew she had earned it. This was not just about her job, it was about becoming the kind of person she wanted to be. As she stepped outside into the warm afternoon sun, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead would not be easy, but for the first time, she welcomed the challenge. She was ready to lead, not because she needed recognition or approval, but because she had learned the true meaning of resilience, humility, and connection. This was her second chance, and she was determined to make the most of it. The crisp afternoon air greeted Emily as she stepped out of the corporate building. The sunlight warmed her face, and for the first time in weeks, the weight that had pressed down on her chest felt lighter. She had walked into the meeting unsure of what Grace Parker would decide, but now she knew. Grace believed in her. But with that belief came an unspoken challenge to continue proving herself, not through grand gestures, but in the quiet, consistent way that built true leadership. As Emily made her way to her car, she replayed Grace's parting words in her mind. "Leadership is a privilege, not a right." The truth of those words resonated deeply. Leadership was not just about title or authority, it was about serving others, being a steady hand in difficult moments, and creating an environment where respect and trust could flourish. The next morning, Emily returned to the airport for her shift with a renewed sense of purpose. The terminal was buzzing with the usual early morning energy, families heading off on vacations, business travelers balancing coffee cups and laptops. Emily arrived at the crew lounge early, reviewing her checklist and preparing for the morning flight. When Mark entered with his usual cheerful grin, he stopped mid-step when he noticed Emily's calm but determined expression. "You're here early," Mark said, sliding into the seat across from her. "Is this the new normal?" Emily smiled. "It might be." Mark grabbed a cup of coffee and leaned in. "So, how did the meeting go? I take it you're still employed, which is a good sign." Emily exhaled a soft laugh. "Yes, I am. Mrs. Parker gave me another chance, but she also made it clear that leadership is something you have to earn every single day." Mark nodded, his expression softening. "That sounds like her. But you've already started earning it, Emily. I've noticed the way you've been handling things lately." Emily felt a flicker of pride but stayed grounded. "Thanks, Mark. I'm still learning, but I feel like I'm finally headed in the right direction." Mark gave her a reassuring nod. "We all are. That's the point." As boarding began for their flight to Seattle, Emily moved through the cabin with a sense of steadiness that she had not felt in months. She greeted each passenger warmly, offering small but genuine gestures, a helping hand with a carry-on, a kind smile to an anxious traveler. About halfway through boarding, she noticed a young woman struggling to balance a stroller and a large diaper bag while holding her toddler's hand. The child's wide, curious eyes scanned the busy cabin, overwhelmed by the noise and movement. Emily stepped forward without hesitation. "Let me help you," she offered, reaching for the bag. The mother's shoulders sagged in relief as she handed it over. "Thank you so much," she said, her voice tired but grateful. "It's just the two of us today, and it's been a lot." Emily smiled gently as she guided them to their row. I get it. Traveling with little ones is tough, but you're doing a great job. The mother's eyes softened as she buckled her child into the seat. That's really kind of you to say. Not everyone's patient with us. Emily nodded as she stowed the diaper bag overhead. We're all just trying to get where we're going. Sometimes, a little kindness makes the trip easier. The woman's gratitude was clear as she settled in. You've already made this trip better for us. Thank you. Emily returned to her position near the galley, but her heart felt lighter. That interaction had reminded her that leadership was not about big speeches or decisions, it was about moments like that. The smallest act of kindness could change someone's entire experience. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, Emily resumed her rounds. She moved through the aisles with care, making sure each passenger felt seen. Near the middle of the flight, Mark stopped her as she passed by with the drink cart. You're really on top of things today, he said quietly. Emily smiled, but her expression was thoughtful. I just keep thinking about what Grace said, she admitted. She told me a story about a mistake she made when she first started the airline. It reminded me that even the best leaders mess up. It's what they do after that defines them. Mark nodded, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. That's true. Everyone messes up, but not everyone chooses to own it and grow from it. He paused before adding, You've done that, Emily. Emily felt her chest swell with quiet pride. Thanks, Mark. As the plane descended toward Seattle, Emily noticed that the young mother and her child had both fallen asleep, their exhaustion finally giving way to rest. She moved carefully, making sure they had their items nearby for a quick departure. When the plane landed and the passengers began disembarking, the mother gave Emily one more grateful smile as she gathered her things. Thanks again, she said softly. You made a real difference for us today. Emily returned the smile, her heart warming at the words. Safe travels, she replied. The cabin emptied quickly as the passengers filtered into the terminal. The crew moved into their post-flight routines, tidying up and preparing for the next leg. Captain Ellis emerged from the cockpit, his eyes scanning the quiet cabin. When he reached Emily, he gave her a nod of approval. I watched you today, he said. You handled everything with patience and care. You've come a long way, Emily. Emily met his gaze with a calm confidence. I'm just trying to keep getting better, she said honestly. Captain Ellis smiled. That's what makes a great leader, the willingness to keep growing. As they left the plane and headed toward the gate, Emily noticed a familiar figure standing near the terminal windows. Grace Parker. She was not wearing her usual business suit today instead. She had on simple cardigan and slacks, blending in with the travelers around her. Grace caught Emily's eye and walked over, her expression composed but warm. Mrs. Parker, Emily greeted her, surprised but pleased. Emily, Grace said with a nod, I wanted to see for myself how you were doing, and I am glad I did. Emily's pulse quickened. I hope I lived up to your expectations. Grace's eyes softened. You did, and more importantly, you lived up to your own potential. She paused before adding, Remember this feeling, Emily. Remember that leadership is about the small things, the quiet moments where character is built. Emily felt the weight of Grace's words settle in her heart. I won't forget, she promised. Grace smiled, the kind of smile that carried respect and trust. Good. As Grace turned and walked away, Emily stood for a moment, absorbing everything she had learned and experienced. She felt the hum of the airport around her, but for once, the chaos felt distant. All she could hear was the steady beat of her own resolve. She had been given a second chance, a rare and precious gift, and she would continue to earn it, one step, one moment, at a time. The flight back from Seattle was quieter than usual. Emily sat in the crew jump seat, staring at the faint glow of the emergency exit sign as the plane sped through the sky. Though she felt more grounded in her purpose, a small part of her wondered how long it would take for her crew to fully trust her again. She had worked hard to regain their respect over the past few weeks, but she knew that rebuilding trust took more than a handful of good shifts. It took time, consistency, and a willingness to support others, especially when things got hard. When the plane began its descent, Emily took a breath and rose from her seat to prepare the cabin. As she walked the aisle, she glanced at her team. Mark was chatting with another flight attendant, Rachel, while they secured the food cart. They were efficient, as always, but Emily noticed something else, something unspoken. Rachel glanced up and met Emily's eyes for a brief second before looking away. The gesture was small, but Emily felt the sting of it. She could still sense some hesitation in her co-workers, the kind that lingered after trust had been shaken. After the plane landed and the passengers disembarked, the crew gathered in the galley to go over their post-flight duties. Emily cleared her throat, hoping to address the weight hanging in the air. "Before we start wrapping up," she began, her voice steady but sincere, "I just want to say thank you to all of you for your hard work today. I know I'm still proving myself to you, and I know that takes time. But I want you to know that I see your efforts, and I'm grateful for them." The galley fell quiet for a moment. Mark's eyes softened as he gave a small nod of encouragement. Rachel shifted but didn't speak. The rest of the crew exchanged glances before returning to their tasks. Emily didn't expect applause or immediate reassurance. She knew that change was a process, not an instant result, but she felt better for having said the words. Later that evening, Emily stayed behind to finish the paperwork. The terminal was nearly empty now, with only a few tired travelers waiting for red-eye flights. The rhythmic hum of the floor polisher in the distance was the only sound that broke the stillness. Emily was halfway through her report when Mark approached, holding a cup of coffee. He set it on the counter beside her clipboard. "You looked like you could use this," he said, his smile warm. Emily gave him a grateful look. "You're a lifesaver." Mark leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. "You know, that speech you gave earlier, it was good." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Good or awkward?" Mark chuckled. "A little of both, but mostly good." He took a sip of his coffee before adding, "Rachel will come around. The others too. It's not about how you start, it's about how you show up, day after day." Emily nodded, absorbing his words. "I hope you're right." "I am," Mark said confidently. "You've already earned my trust back. And if you keep being honest, you'll earn theirs too." Emily felt a flicker of hope. Mark's belief in her meant more than she could express. "Thanks, Mark. I needed to hear that." "Any time," he replied with a grin. "Now, finish up so you can get some rest. You've got another early shift tomorrow." Emily laughed softly. "Yes, sir." The next day, Emily arrived at the airport feeling more energized. Her morning flight was scheduled for a cross-country trip to New York, a long shift, but one she was looking forward to. As she boarded the plane and began her pre-flight checks, she noticed Rachel standing by the mid-cabin exit, folding blankets. Emily hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "Hey, Rachel, do you need a hand with those?" Rachel looked up, surprised by the offer. She paused, then handed Emily a few of the neatly folded blankets. "Sure, thanks." They worked in silence for a few moments before Rachel finally spoke. "Emily, about everything that happened before, I guess I just didn't know what to expect from you after all that. But I've been watching, and I can see that you're really trying." Emily felt a wave of relief, but kept her tone even. "I get it. I let you down before, and I'm sorry for that. I'm just trying to earn back your trust, one day at a time." Rachel nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "You're doing a good job so far." Emily returned the smile. "Thanks, Rachel. That means a lot." The plane soon filled with passengers, and the usual pre-flight buzz of chatter and movement filled the cabin. Emily moved down the aisle with confidence, greeting passengers and assisting with last-minute requests. Midway through the flight, a commotion broke out near the back. A man was standing, visibly upset, his voice rising as he argued with the passenger next to him. Emily exchanged a glance with Mark before stepping forward calmly. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice calm but authoritative. "Is there something I can help you with?" The man turned, his expression tense. "He took my bag down from the overhead and shoved it under his seat without asking." Emily nodded, her tone steady. "Let's take a breath. I'm sure we can sort this out." She crouched slightly so that she was eye level with the man. "Why don't we take a step back so you can explain what happened from the beginning?" Her calm demeanor seemed to ease the tension slightly. The man took a deep breath and explained his frustration more clearly. After listening carefully, Emily turned to the other passenger, who nodded and apologized for the misunderstanding. Emily quickly helped rearrange their bags and ensured that each passenger felt heard. The tension dissolved as they both settled back into their seats, muttering polite agreements. Mark watched from a distance, his expression impressed. As Emily returned to the front of the cabin, he leaned toward her and whispered, "You handled that perfectly." Emily gave a small smile. "One step at a time, right?" Mark nodded. "Exactly." When the flight finally landed in New York, Emily felt exhausted but proud. As the passengers filed out, a few offered quiet words of thanks, and Emily felt the weight of their gratitude in every nod and smile. As the last passenger stepped off, Rachel approached her again, this time with a genuine smile. "You really are different, Emily," she said, "and I'm glad. It's good to have you back." Emily felt a swell of emotion in her chest. "Thanks, Rachel. That means more than you know." Rachel nodded before heading to the galley. Emily stood alone for a moment, letting the quiet of the empty cabin wash over her. She thought back to Grace Parker's quiet confidence, to Mark's unwavering support, and to the strength it took to rebuild trust after a fall. This was what growth felt like, not an instant transformation, but a slow, steady climb. And as Emily gathered her things and walked out into the busy terminal, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The evening air at JFK Airport was thick with the hum of planes taxiing across the tarmac and the chatter of passengers rushing to their gates. As Emily stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, she felt a rare kind of peace settle over her. It had been a long day, a challenging day, but one she could look back on with pride. Her interactions with Rachel, Mark, and the passengers had shown her how far she had come. Every choice she had made, from the way she handled the mother with the toddler to the way she de-escalated the argument at the back of the plane, had reinforced the lessons she had learned from Grace Parker. She paused near a window, watching as the last rays of the sunset cast the city skyline in gold. A month ago, she would have second-guessed every decision she made on a flight. Now she felt steady. Not perfect, but steady. Mark caught up to her, his bag slung over one shoulder. "Heading to the crew room?" he asked with a grin. Emily nodded. "Yeah, I need to wrap up a few things before heading out." Mark adjusted his bag and gave her a meaningful look. "You know, you're not just back to where you were, Emily. You've gone beyond that. People look up to you now." Emily felt warmth spread through her chest. She knew Mark meant it, and that meant more than any promotion ever could. "Thanks, Mark," she said sincerely. "I couldn't have gotten here without you." Mark shrugged, though his grin widened. "True. I am pretty great." Emily laughed and shook her head as they walked toward the crew lounge. The room was buzzing with life as flight attendants from other shifts gathered their belongings, swapped stories, and grabbed their last cups of coffee. The soft hum of conversation was comforting, a reminder of the community they had built. As Emily sat down to complete her post-flight report, the door to the lounge opened, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Grace Parker. Emily blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She wasn't expecting to see her here, not today. Grace's presence seemed to quiet the room as heads turned. But Grace didn't make a scene. She never did. Instead, she walked calmly to where Emily was sitting, her usual composed expression softening into something warmer. "Emily?" Grace greeted her. Emily rose from her chair, trying to hide her surprise. "Mrs. Parker." Grace glanced at the clipboard in Emily's hand. "Still finishing up?" Emily nodded. "Just wrapping up the report from today's flight." Grace smiled slightly. "Good. I heard things went well today." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "You did?" Grace folded her hands in front of her. "Word travels fast when there's something worth hearing." She paused, her gaze steady but kind. "I'm not here to check in on you today, Emily. I'm here because I wanted to congratulate you in person." Emily felt her breath catch. "Congratulate me?" Grace nodded. "The feedback from your team and your captains has been unanimous. You've not only earned back their trust, you've earned their respect. You've demonstrated that leadership isn't about authority, it's about service, empathy, and consistency. And because of that, I'd like to offer you a promotion to Flight Service Team Leader." The room seemed to tilt for a second as Emily processed the words. She had hoped, deep down, that one day she would be ready for leadership again. But this soon? After everything? Grace's eyes softened, as if she could sense Emily's thoughts. "You've earned this, Emily. But more importantly, I believe you're ready." A wave of gratitude and disbelief washed over Emily, followed by a quiet, steady resolve. She thought about every challenge, every misstep, and every moment she had spent learning from them. She thought about the team she had worked so hard to support, the passengers she had served, and the way Grace's lessons had reshaped her view of leadership. "I'm honored," Emily said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you, Mrs. Parker. I'll do everything I can to live up to this." Grace's rare smile deepened. "I have no doubt that you will." As Grace walked out of the crew lounge, Emily remained standing for a moment, absorbing the moment. The quiet murmur of her colleagues began to fill the room again, though some still watched her with curiosity and admiration. Mark walked up, wide-eyed and grinning. "Did I just hear what I think I heard?" Emily let out a breathless laugh. "Yeah, she offered me the promotion." Mark clapped a hand on her shoulder. "That's incredible, Emily. You deserve it." Emily smiled, but this time it was a smile born of humility rather than pride. "Thanks, Mark. I've had some good people to learn from." Rachel approached, her expression softer than usual. "Congratulations, Emily," she said sincerely. "I mean it." "Thanks, Rachel," Emily replied, meeting her eyes. "That means a lot." The rest of the day passed in a blur of congratulations and quiet reflection. By the time Emily left the airport, night had fallen, and the city lights sparkled in the cool evening air. As she walked to her car, she thought about how far she had come. The young flight attendant who had once believed that leadership was about control had grown into someone who understood that true leadership came from patience, kindness, and resilience. Grace Parker had given her a second chance, but Emily knew that her growth had come not just from being given the opportunity, but from the choices she had made along the way. Several months later, Emily stood at the front of the cabin on an early morning flight. She wore her new flight service leader pin with pride, but also with humility. Her team worked seamlessly beside her, each interaction flowing with care and respect. A new flight attendant, Lena, fresh out of training, was struggling to organize the drink cart. Emily noticed Lena's nervous glances and stepped over. "Hey, you're doing fine," Emily said gently. "Let me show you a trick to keep the bottles from sliding around." Lena's shoulders relaxed as Emily guided her through the process. "Thanks, Emily," Lena said. "I was afraid I was messing everything up." Emily smiled. "Everyone feels that way at first, but you'll get the hang of it. And if you ever need help, I'm here." As the plane climbed into the sky, Emily felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. She had once stood where Lena was unsure, afraid to make mistakes. But now, she was leading the way Grace had taught her, with patience, integrity, and the belief that people could rise if they were given the chance. As she looked out at the sea of clouds, she knew this was not the end of her journey. It was only the beginning of something even greater, and she was ready. As Emily stood at the front of the plane, watching her team work together with confidence and care, she felt a deep sense of purpose. She had faced setbacks, made mistakes, and learned valuable lessons along the way. But she had grown stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. The journey had shaped her into a true leader, not because she had authority, but because she had earned trust and respect by showing up for others, one moment at a time. Her story was proof that second chances could lead to something greater, as long as you embrace the opportunity with resilience, humility, and heart. Emily knew that challenges would always come, but she was ready to face them with courage, grace, and an unwavering belief in the power of kindness. If this story inspired you, make sure to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you. And if you enjoy stories about growth, second chances, and perseverance, subscribe to our channel for more uplifting stories that remind us of the strength we all carry within. Thank you for watching, and remember, every step forward, no matter how small, brings you closer to becoming the best version of yourself.